Our next speaker will be Father Chris Yates, an occasional contributor to The Spectator's Flat White. Father Chris is a classical liberal who understands the Christian gospel to be best interpreted through this tradition. A member of the Society of the Holy Cross, a traditionalist society within the Anglican Communion, he has contributed to conferences of the Anglican Orthodox Dialogue in Oxford and is currently exploring a transition into the Russian Orthodox Church. Please give it up for Father Chris.
James, it's always wonderful to hear the zeal of a convert. I remember when I converted, I got one of those little wristbands that said, WWJD, what would Jesus do? And it's always worth bearing in mind that can involve taking out a whip and cracking people across a table. So I'm not completely sold on your non-aggression when it comes to Jesus, but I think it was for a particular purpose. So anyway, sorry about that. But wonderful to hear your zeal. I'm actually not used to reading scripts. I don't preach with notes normally, but I'm not preaching today. I'm talking about a particular topic, and I thought, I need to be careful. I'm talking to libertarians here. And so I'm going to read, if you don't mind. It may seem strange to you that a traditionalist priest of the church would have something to contribute to a conference supporting libertarian principles. I mean, isn't the church a bottomless pit of didactic, moralizing rules? Doesn't the church seek to infiltrate every part of your life, from your bedroom to your investment portfolio? Well, it's true that the church claims to be the vault of divine revelation, of God's supreme plan for all humanity and for you as individuals. It's true that the church has been both good and awful at promoting these values. And it's true that the church seeks to gather all people to an understanding of the deposit of faith handed down from the apostles, those first followers of Christ. Yes, the church can be presented as the ultimate nanny. And over the last few centuries, since the Reformations of the 16th century, there has been much dissent, discussion, and disregarding of what the church is and what she has to offer. At its best, the church, in seeking to preserve the faith handed down from the saints, has engaged some of the greatest minds in history. Intellectual giants such as St. Augustine of Hippo, who gave us his famous tome, The City of God, as well as his Confessions, and St. Thomas Aquinas with his Summa Theologica. They advanced human thought significantly. And though it's hard for people like me to imagine that there's anything beyond the world of theology and philosophy, the church has even produced significant academics in the realm of the natural sciences. For example, Augustinian friar Gregor Mendel, who is credited as the founder of the modern science of genetics. The church and academia have gone hand in hand from the beginning. Despite famous errors, or perhaps because of them, such as the persecution of Galileo, the church throughout her history has had a commitment to academic rigor. Indeed, the first universities were established by the church. I've been a beneficiary of the monastics who established a university in the obscure marshy land of Oxford. And it was naughty monks who abandoned this fine institution to establish some god-awful place near Peterborough, the C word I never say. The church established hospitals to care for the sick, schools to teach children to read and write, contributed to the Westminster system of parliamentary democracy, and all without the help of a taxpayer-funded government. But something sinister has happened. Indeed, for a priest like me, the word demonic might even be appropriate. You see, like the rest of Western culture, the church is suffering from a virus, a very nasty and pernicious one, namely the disease that is social justice. A cursory glance through the mission statements of various Christian denominations in Australia will tell you, often with shameless virtue signalling thrown in for free, that social justice is at the centre of what they do. In fact, it seems to be a greater priority for them than the gospel of Jesus Christ. And what's wrong with that? Why is social justice a bad goal? And why do I claim that it's a greater threat to the church than any number of YouTube atheists? Social justice is predicated on a flawed philosophical principle that's fundamentally anti-theist. The Oxford Dictionary defines social justice like this. There are other dictionaries, apparently. The objective of creating a fair and equal society in which each individual matters. Their rights are recognised and protected, and decisions are made in ways that are fair and honest. Now, I'll admit that on first reading, there's much to be celebrated in the stated aims of social justice. Libertarians rightly agree that individual rights over their property and freedom to make our own decisions are an inherently good thing. But the idea that society should strive to be equal is an affront to basic science and logic. In fact, we celebrate the inequality of life every time we watch the Olympics. Well, Mrs. Thatcher, or as I like to call her, Our Lady of Grantham, perhaps there my thinly veiled Tory nature is revealed, famously concluded that there was no such thing as society. She continued, there are individual men and women, and there are families, and no government can do anything except through people, and people must look after themselves first. It is our duty to look after ourselves, and then to look after our neighbours. And the authors of the US Constitution shared this philosophy. It's like Our Lady of Grantham was channeled through those great founding fathers, perhaps. And this great declaration includes a reference to equality. But this is not the equality of the social justice warrior collectivists. No, this was and remains an acknowledgement of equality before God. This equality has nothing to do with access to resources or politically correct anti-language focused on persona validation. It's the equality of being equally loved and accepted by God, the sovereign power from whom all truth and gifts find their source, not to mention our inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Just as governments are vulnerable to the prevailing attitude that someone should do something about this, usually at taxpayers' expense, so too the church can be a victim of the same demand from her more wobbly adherents. Worst of all is when church leaders call on governments to do something, often claiming grants funded by taxpayers, and surely this is the worst of both worlds. Our Lady of Grantham once famously made the case that the Good Samaritan was able to help the injured Israelite because he had his own private means. This is at the heart of my concern. The Christian life is to personally take responsibility for loving God, neighbour, and self. The big government social justice warriors, faced with the injured Israelite, would have called the Judean authorities and asked them to send a uniformed official to deal with the mess. Christianity calls for a hands-on approach, a personal call. The liberty that God endowed us with is to be used to choose to do what is right and just. True freedom to the Christian is not an aimless thrashing at what we think might be good for others. It is getting our own house in perfect order, as Jordan Peterson would say, and being so conformed to righteousness that we act out in that righteousness to serve our fellow man. While governments measure the cost of the social justice warriors' mission in terms of increased taxation and increasing the national debt, the church measures the cost in dwindling numbers. If the goal is to create utopia on earth, then why worry about building up your treasures in heaven? As the church has retreated from the convictions that led to direct action in establishing hospitals, schools, and universities, so too has its relevance retreated from contemporary society. When the church stops being the church and turns into a lobby group calling on governments, it's worse than useless. To turn the tide in the West against church decline and an unaffordable role for government, Christians need to return to the realization that it is the individual's response to God that changes the world for the better. And I'll end with some words from my favourite cleric, a Roman Catholic, the Venerable Fulton Sheen. And it sums up the questions Christians should consider when measuring their own success. Show me your hands. Do they have scars from giving? Show me your feet. Are they wounded in service? Show me your heart. Have you left a place for divine love? Thank you.
Got a number of questions here. Is Jordan Peterson a force for good?
I think, since I'm kind of almost a signed-up member of the Jordan Peterson fan club, I think I'll take this one. I think he is. And I've heard, I've pretty much heard everything that goes on YouTube, which, was not that much, and then all of a sudden was everything. And I kind of just was tuned into him just as that went nuts, which I think was a great privilege, really. But he constantly resists answering the question, or he constantly qualifies an answer to the question, are you a Christian? And part of the reason I think, what I've heard him say, chimes with me. Now, I can't walk around the streets of Sydney like this and claim I'm not a Christian. I'm not always a very good one. But, there's a kind of, obvious signifier with that. And you take all of the assumptions and the presumptions that people make about you, about Christianity, which Christianity, and inevitably it actually comes down a lot, particularly in Australia, to that kind of temperance movement, moralising way of thinking about Christianity. Jordan Peterson doesn't want to get into that because it's a massive distraction from what's important. Now, people like me, we get involved in that because we're parish priests. We have to be concerned with what people are concerned about. But I think in resisting the answer to the question, what he's really saying is, you don't know what you're asking me. Yeah. Because you say, are you a Christian? Well, you don't know what a Christian is. And therefore, if he just said yes, instantly it would close down a lot of his audience simply because they just don't want to listen to a Christian tell them what to do. That's their kind of prejudice that they bring to this conversation. And so he resists that. So is he a force for good for the church? Absolutely. Because he gives a narrative. He says, you know what? You think you're so free, my little atheist friend. You're free to do what you want. You don't need idiots like me telling you what to do. And you go, well, actually, firstly, you've got no idea what you want. Secondly, that freedom to do whatever you want is tyranny. There's no freedom in that at all. We can give you multiple examples from history. Well, you probably know some from your own life. I know some from my own life. Doing what you want can lead to tyranny, not freedom. But actually, he says, you know what? You're not the first human beings that have ever lived. And the church should be saying this in every generation. In fact, lots of church priests and bishops need to hear that point as well, when they think they can reinvent the gospel in their own lifetime. Not mentioning the rector of Gosford. Because actually that's not Christianity. If somebody asked me, are you a Christian? And that was the prerequisite, I'd say absolutely not. So I think what he says is, no, you're not the first people that have ever lived. The church should do that too. That's why it's good to appeal to the apostles, to the saints, because there's humility in that. You're saying, don't let me tell you about confessions. Let's listen to St. Augustine of Hippo. He knows a couple of things about it. It seems to have survived 1,000 years. Maybe his views are more important than mine. There's a humility in it. What Jordan Peterson's doing is saying, these are the repeated narratives. So if you're a theist, you're an atheist, so what? You're a human. And human beings have these common threads that reappear, this battle between chaos and order, this, all of the examples he gives from Cyrus, all the way through the scriptures. He is an absolute force for good because there is no point in this sort of post-Reformation world, some call it a post-Christian world, but I'm not sure the world was ever Christian. There's no point saying, let me tell you, about the Ten Commandments. There's no point, you can't start there. You can't start with Jesus said this. You have to start with, you're a human being and human beings face the same dilemma, the same philosophical battles, ideological battles in every lifetime. And rather than having to learn all those mistakes yourself, let's look at these patterns and try and learn, so maps of meaning. Yeah. Let's try and find some meaning in mapping human existence. that's what makes it relevant. That's why it is very important for our generation to have people like Jordan Peterson. And he can only, in a way, he would never have been able to cut through it if he'd have been wearing this cassock. And he may or may not be a Christian. Who knows what that means? What does it mean to say that anyway? I hope I am. You know, I'm baptized. I kind of do what I can. I hope I'm a Christian. But what Jordan Peterson's saying is actually being bothered about this, in a sense, identity politics. Are you a Christian?
Yeah.
It's like saying, you know, are you male, female, are you transgender? To resist that and say, I'm a person who thinks that humanity has had these battles, these issues that are common throughout history. And that's why I think he's a force for good, because as a Christian, I would say, and in fact, all of those disruptions, all of those bumps, chasms, actually converge and come together on the cross. And therefore, apply any criticism you like to the scriptures, they will survive. The Christian gospel will survive criticism. You can't do this to Islam. That's why, you know, they'll bomb you and burn your house down, because, you know, you can't survive feminist criticism. It can't, you know, Christianity can. We've got nothing to fear from it. And Jordan Peterson's saying there's nothing to fear from these things.
What can the pro-life movement learn from the Libertarians, particularly with the referendum in Ireland on the legislation of abortion and the recent Alfie Evans saga?
What's the Alfie Evans saga?
Alfie Evans was a young boy in the UK who was refused medical care after a time. He was basically, the medical system decided it was time for him to die against his parents' wishes.
There are pro-life movements. You know, some are clanging gongs. They want to go around, you know, pointing at people and saying, you know, you dirty cow, you know, what's wrong with you? None of that helps. What a lot of people, I'm not here to be an apologist for the Roman Catholic Church, but what a lot of people don't know is the Roman Catholic Church does more to help women who've had abortions than any other charity on earth, in terms of, you know, bottom line financing and practicality. I think, for me, the pro-life issue, I'm banned from talking about it in the office, but I work for Senator Linehelm as a policy advisor, and banned from talking about this in the office because he and I disagree. And I would say, well, a basic libertarian issue is the right to live your life the way you choose. And you know, the ultimate discussion point is, where does that life begin? And so for people who are pro-life, we say, well, that life begins as a zygote, you know, at fertilizing. Contrary to popular opinion, some priests know something about science. So it begins, you know, we would say it begins there, where there's the possibility for life. And we wouldn't consider an unborn baby being the property of a mother. If you do think an unborn baby is the property of a mother, you have a different point of view, you know. And so that's where libertarians get divided, because libertarians can be pro-life and not. And in terms of the Alfie issue, what's really worrying, where they can learn from libertarians, is what that case said was that the state owns a child.
Yeah.
And a libertarian, any libertarian of any hue, male, female, black, white, you know, gay, straight, anybody, whatever labels you want to put on people, would say, the state does not bloody well own me. Nor does it own my son, nor does it own anybody, any individual. The state cannot own you. That is communism. You know, and so actually that can inform pro-life people. Because pro-life people operating from care, conservatives operating from care, would say, how can you harm this baby? That's not going to always work. And so actually when libertarians can inform it as a rights issue, to say, how can the state have a right over the life of this child? And I think it's a pretty well accepted principle in humanity, that until a child is old enough to make its own decisions, parents make those decisions for them. And where a parent says, I want this child to live, I believe that is a right that must be respected. But it comes from a libertarian principle rather than from a, you know, from a social conservative point of view to say that. And the question then comes, well, who pays for it? You know, well, this is the nightmare you've got when you've got state-funded healthcare. But that's a separate issue.
Amen. Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. That concludes our panel. But if you could all please stand, gentlemen, and if you could all show your appreciation for our speakers today. Thank you.